My name is Osama Khan. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at LUMS, and I'll be moderating this last session of today, which looks at fresh perspectives in development and macroeconomic research. We have three panelists. So just some housekeeping, just a reminder, so each panelist has 15 minutes to present, followed by a 5-minute discussion. And then we'll have hopefully 10 minutes at the end of each presentation for Q&A. If I can start off with Saqib Hussain from the Korean Development Institute, who'll be talking about the impact of terrorism on education, evidence from the death of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Your slides, yes? Okay. Okay.
Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you for coming and attending this session. My name is Saqib Hussain and I am PhD student at Korean Development Institute. Professor Yoon is my advisor and co-author for this paper, and we are looking at the impact of terrorism on education. If you have any question during my presentation, feel free to stop me. So the motivation, we already know that terrorism has direct economic and human impacts, with terrorists aiming to maximize their influence. But they often try to target the sensitive groups like girls and schools to spread fear, panic, and get the media attention. Secondly, Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, they see the contemporary education system as promoting secularism and liberal values, which is conflict with their interpretation of Islamic teachings. Secondly, terrorists aim to prevent the emergence of educated individuals who might resist their extreme ideologies in the future. But there is little evidence on the relationship between terrorism and education. So we aim to address a very simple question, the effect of terrorism on education, but the question can be divided into two parts. The first one is the impact of death of Osama bin Laden on terrorism, and then the subsequent effect on education. So in this paper, we explore the unintended consequences of his death on attacks that can result into the impact on education. We utilize three data sources. The first one is Global Terrorism Database. Second one is the Pakistan Social Living Measurement Surveys. And third one is on the education, which is ACER. And then we used his death as an instrument for the attacks. So we contribute in two main topics. The first one is the causes and consequences of terrorism. There is a lot of literature on this, and the findings are mixed across different contexts. But this paper focuses on the effect of terrorism on education. Secondly, there is some literature on that explores the effect of terrorism on education in different countries, but we focus on the backlash effect of his death and then its impacts on education in Pakistan. So this is the preview of the findings of this paper. The first is his death increased the terrorist attacks on education and also the overall attacks. Secondly, those increase in attacks led to a decrease in educational attainments. We used different outcome variables, which is like average years of education, primary school completion rates, enrollment, dropout, and child labor. And we find the more pronounced impacts on girls and high socioeconomic status areas. We also find that the academic performance has declined almost 0.1 standard deviation in math, English, and reading scores. So basically this paper is based on the backlash effect of the counterterrorism strategies. So as I said, we used his death. This paper, what we have learned about terrorism since 9/11, this is published in Journal of Economic Literature, and they synthesize almost all of the counterterrorism strategies, and they find there could be some unintended consequences of those strategies. And the target killing and killing the leaders, they said it could have the negative consequences. But still there is debate, for example, the airstrikes and other counterterrorism strategies. Some works and some did not. But the death of Osama bin Laden, it dealt a significant blow to Al-Qaeda and its affiliated jihadist group, which triggers a wave of retaliatory attacks against the government, education, military, and citizens. Furthermore, his death disrupted the structure of the Al-Qaeda, which could lead to a decentralization of extremist groups that also increased the terrorism activities. And these anti-terrorism operations and the subsequent rise in attacks had profound implications for civilian populations, specifically terrorist targeted educational institutions. So basically in the history of Pakistan, we see two major events. The first one is the Red Mosque siege and the other one is his death. They increased the terrorist attacks in Pakistan. So we instrument both of the events, but in this presentation, I just focus on the death of Osama bin Laden and its impact on education. But the results were consistent using both of the instruments. So you can see that I prepared three maps. The first one is the its aggregated number of attacks within districts before the Red Mosque siege. And I used the period of 1931 days, which was the period between the Red Mosque siege and his death. So these three maps are comparable. And you can see that the KP region is affected by the first event, and you can see the increase here. And then after his death, there is a lot of increase in attacks. So our treatment group is KP and control group is the rest of the districts in Pakistan. This shows the trend of terrorist attacks in KP region and the other districts in Pakistan. As you can see that the first increase is here in 2007 when there was a siege of the Red Mosque. And then we can see a sharp increase in 2011. And then there is a decrease here, which is, I think, because of the National Action Plan and other operations in KP region. And before this 2006, we can see that there is a parallel trend here. So it means there is no difference in attacks in both of the regions. So this is just the summary statistics of all three data sets that we use, the GTD, PSLM, and ACER data. This is the t-test table, and if you can see the joint p-value, it's greater than 0.05, which shows there is no difference in terms of terrorist attacks between affected and unaffected region before the Red Mosque siege. So our estimation strategy is very simple. It's generally known strategy, the effect of conflict or terror on the educational outcomes. But here it's IJT, it means the individual's education, and this JT means the aggregated number of attacks in the districts. But we know that the terrorist attacks are endogenous. There could be so many confounding factors and other factors that can increase the terrorist attacks. So therefore, we instrument the Red Mosque siege and death of Osama bin Laden on terrorist attacks. So we use the interaction of this one. The treatment J is the location and post is the time period, and I see the effect on attacks, and then I use these predicted attacks as independent variable to see the effect on education. This is the event study. It's simple, but I can explain simply. So basically, we use two different strategies. In the first one, we compare the age group 5 to 18 with 19 to 32 years old in 2020. So it means that those who were at the schooling age at the time of his death is our treatment group. And those who completed their education just before his death is our control group. This is the first stage estimations. You can see that there is a significant increase in the attacks, in total attacks after his death, and then there is a significant increase in education. On government, it's insignificant, but you can see a couple of significant coefficients here in the human and economic damages. We use the time fixed effect area, and for this one, because we have geocoded data for terrorist attacks, we clustered at the tehsil level. But for the educational outcomes, we clustered at the district level. These are the IV estimates and the main table of this paper. We can see that there is a significant decrease in education. It is 0.52 years of schooling, which is decreased, and it's significant. But we can see that the boys are unaffected, but the girls are affected, which is aligned with our baseline. And then similarly, we can see the primary education completion rates. The boys' education is unaffected, whereas girls' education is significantly affected. So this one is the event study. Figure 5 is for the years of education, and figure 6 is for primary education completion rates. So you can see that from this side, 5 to 18 years of age, this is our treatment group, and 19 to 32 is control. So those who were at the schooling age at the time of his death, their education is highly affected. And you can see that there is quite big coefficient for 5 to almost 10 years of age. Why? Because they exposed more years in the schooling after his death. Then we find some interesting heterogeneous effects. So this is for the gender. We can see that the boys are unaffected, and this one is the exposure. It means that those who spent 10 years of schooling after his death, their education is highly affected. Those who spent 5 to 9, it's moderately affected, while the placebo group, they are not affected. Secondly, we find that the high socioeconomic households, in terms of income and parents' education, those groups are more affected. And similarly, in the occupation classifications, agriculture ones are not affected, while the manufacturing and services are more affected. I think this is because terrorists try to maximize their influence, so that's why they used to target the high income groups and girls. This is kind of a placebo test. So there were some districts that were unaffected in KP region. I mean, there were like less number of attacks. So if we compare the attacks below the mean and below the median, their education is not affected, while when the attacks are above mean and above median, their education is significantly affected. So we use some other variables like enrollment, dropout, and child labor. But the estimation strategy is a little bit different here. Why? Because we have almost like binary variables in this case. Therefore, we use the aggregated number of attacks during the first enrollment year of the children. So we see that boys and girls, both groups are affected. Their enrollment is decreased, dropout has been increased. But for the child labor, if you see, the boys' child labor has been increased, but not for girls. So we are further looking into it, what happened to them, and we expect that they might get into the child marriages. But secondly, we see that the boys and girls' education is affected here. But in terms of years of education, the boys' education is not affected. So it means that the boys can cope up with the education with the passage of time. But these are the absolute values of enrollment and dropouts. And then we use the academic performance variables, math, English, and reading. But unfortunately, we don't have pre-treatment data in this case because the ASES surveys were started in 2012, and the age group is like 3 to 16 years, which is basically our treatment group. But what we did is we calculated the aggregated number of attacks for every age within every survey year. And then we see that the KP regions, their children education is affected. I mean, their scores are affected. But the other regions in Pakistan, they remains unaffected. So the summary of findings are the attacks increased by 2.6 times, whereas the attacks on education is increased by almost 3.5 times. The girls' education is more affected, reduced by almost 1 year, while the boys' education remained unaffected. We find that math, English, and reading scores are decreased by 1 standard deviation and significant effects on enrollment, dropouts, and child labor. To conclude this paper, I think eliminating the leader of a terrorist group, it can increase the backlash effect. So the counter-terrorism strategies should carefully be chosen, and then it could have the unintended consequences, as I explained, and then the elimination of a terrorist leader can provoke the attacks, which can affect the educational opportunities. So the counterterrorism strategies should go beyond operational measures to address and mitigate the unintended negative consequences. I think that's it from my side. So over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Saqib, for this ambitious paper. You've put together a lot of data and worked hard to take on a really powerful analysis, one that I think is all the more important given that yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the APS attacks. And I think if anyone hasn't seen it, there's an amazing article in the Dawn which details a lot of the accounts of the families who survived at that experience. So I have a few comments for you. I think some that come as criticism, but hopefully with some suggestions as well. So the first is in terms of the data. I think you needed to provide a definition of terrorism. I mean, you didn't in the presentation, but you didn't in the paper. What you did say in the paper was something along the lines of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, fair enough. But I think you need to make a statement around the political use of violence and stick to it, because in the absence of a definition from you, we're left with what the indicator does, and the GTD database has its own definition of what is terrorism. So I went to that GTD database, but here I think there's something important that you really need to take note of, which is that they substantially changed the way that they gathered data in 2012, which is a crucial year for you, right? So if you're not familiar with that, you have to acknowledge it, but if you are familiar, then you need to explain that in the data for the reader, because they changed their data collection in a manner that makes it more effective, that they're generating more results because of the way they're accumulating information. So in the absence of anything else, that would generate some of the increase in attacks that you're interested in talking about. I note that the terrorism data is at the tehsil level, but educational attainment is at the district level. I just mentioned that because if there was a way for you to push the educational attainment down to the tehsil level, that would give you so much more analytical leverage and power. I think over the past, yesterday we saw both Mohammed bin Khalid's paper, which you commented on, and then also Saad Gulzar's paper, where because you had like a more microspatial connection, you were able to say much more interesting things. Although that analysis you do on the placebo effect is important because it shows that the less affected districts are able to avoid some of the negativity of the effects of terrorism. I think it's a background to the paper, but the account of the 2007 to 2011 period, which, by the way, is when I lived in Islamabad, and is usually considered the height of the Great War on Terror. I think you're over-reliant on a single paper there, which is Sohrawardi and Khatak. I think you could expand that, and that would be to your benefit in looking at the dynamics there. Which brings me to a different criticism, which is that you start your conclusion by saying that the killing of Osama bin Laden is regarded as a pivotal and unexpected event in the War on Terror. Unexpected, certainly. Pivotal, I wouldn't say so. I think that by the time he died, he was less relevant, certainly, to a lot of the activity that was happening. The US had been in Afghanistan for the best part of, 10 years by then. There were so many more dynamics that were happening. And so someone like me can disagree, we can have a back and forth on it, but what I would say to you is that actually it's irrelevant to your argument. Osama bin Laden doesn't matter. That there's an increase in attacks and the attacks have an effect on education is what you're interested in. So don't get distracted. I think the things that you can say about the global war on terror, the US-led violent response to pushing a certain regime change in Afghanistan, which was ultimately a failure, right? We see the manifestation of that, what it meant for the lived experience of people on the ground. All of that is what's relevant to you, and no one will ever argue with you if you say that this consequence was because of, the disruption of education due to the violence. But I think that takes us to The separate thing, which is something was missing, was the state as an actor and its response. Like we mentioned drones briefly in the paper, and that horrific phrase collateral damage that's used to sort of neglect the violence that was done to the people who lived there in the pursuit of anti-terrorist aims. I think this would tie you into, if you were to extend the reach of the paper in terms of years, I think you would have a lot of interesting years to work with, because it's after the APS attack that the state does put together the National Action Plan on Counterterrorism, that there is large-scale violent activity that, state-led suppression of militancy that leads to the plateauing effect you're talking about. But it's at the same time coupled with massive dissatisfaction within KP about what it means to be Pashtun and how one is being treated within Pakistan in there. So I think there's a lot to work with. It's a rich and powerful data set. You've shown some strong analytical ability in doing it. I encourage you to refine the work, and I'm impressed by all that you've done so far. Thanks.
Do you want to respond, Saqib, or should we open up to the audience and take a few more questions? Okay. So we'll open up the questions to the audience. If you have a question or a comment, raise your hand, and then somebody with a mic will.
I have to say, I was really intrigued by your title, particularly because I wanted to come and see the link. I have a couple of questions. So it's interesting you picked the siege of the Red Mosque, but you didn't talk about why that particular event. I mean, there's been so many terrorist attacks, so why that? That's my first question. Secondly, why not the APS school attack? If we're talking about the effect of terrorism on education, here was a direct terrorism attack on a school. Did that affect people sending their kids to school? And then in terms of your control, sorry, you went very quickly, I couldn't see. Do you control for state budget, state spending on education?
Yeah, we almost control for every variable, like most of them, but not over controlling. So
and
we
the
control
other thing I was thinking also about was that we've also seen Pakistan move towards Islamization, and it's become more conservative, particularly that part of the country, which sadly also means covering up girls, don't send them out, don't send them to school. So I wonder if that's something you think about. If it's just a correlation, not really a causation. Maybe it might be something else that's driving it. So I'm just curious if it is actually just terrorism. And I think the last thing I have a little bit of a problem is you said in your conclusion that we need to think about our anti-terrorism strategies, and maybe sort of killing the leader of this organization was not the best strategy. I don't know if that seemed a bit problematic to me. Surely that's not our take home, that we should not or we should not address those who are engaging in terrorism because it could lead to reduced schooling.
I would start with your last question. So, for example, and as Professor said, like we could be interested in the state state willingness to counter the terrorism. So this map, for example, like this sharp decrease, this is because of the state willingness. So why? Because they started the military operations at the ground level. And secondly, about the so yes, for the control variables, we control for the all the political factors and all the spendings on the education and everything. Yeah, so for example, if there is a shock at the country level, then it doesn't make any difference in this analysis. But let's say if there is a shock in the KP region in 2011 at the same time of his death, then it could make a difference. But for that, we control for the district fixed effect. So I think it can partial out those effects. So if there are some unobserved factors, for example, like airstrikes and others, they are confounding factors. So they can affect even both. So that's why we instrument his death. So now our attacks are exogenous in this case. So that's why I think we can maybe I should be more humble, not causation, but let's say correlation. But still we see there is some effect. Okay, I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area. I don't know. It's very interesting. So and you probably know more than I do. So I was just curious if you.
Okay, by the way, if you want to look at the paper, I can say. Yes.
So I'll start with a disclaimer that I'm not an economist, but I do research education in KP and the effects of violence and conflict on the broader landscape of education policy is actually what I'm looking at right now. So I'm just really curious to know, just from a broader kind of discussion perspective, some of the results that you guys were showing, maybe I'm misreading them, but it seems like there is a relationship between attacks identified as being on education going up at the same time that attacks on law enforcement agencies or their spaces go up. And for many years during the war on terror, lots of schools were actually being used by the Pakistan Army. And so they had already been evacuated. They were no longer functioning schools. You still see some of that in South KP right now. When you say attacks on education, do you mean that there were active attacks on schools? Just, are you able to say anything about what that data looks like? I'm sorry if you mentioned it and I might have missed it, but I just wonder whether there are some kind of, like, I don't know what you would call them, but some kind of indirect effects. So if you destroy schools, infrastructure, you kind of cut off access to a lot of these places, and typically it will be the girls whose access, when is cut off, will be hit hardest because it's very unsafe for them to move. And also, if you attack law enforcement officers, does that just change the dynamic of how parents are thinking about sending their kids to school? So was there any thinking or reading, or did you see any data around that? Because I just want to put on record, I have never seen resistance to girls' education in Pukhtunkhwa. It's really about other infrastructural issues than it is about conservative lines, whatever.
Yeah, for example, like about the definition of the attacks. So in this one, actually we use the GTD definition as it is, but I will look into more as Professor mentioned. So if you see, there are different variables here, but we use this column 2, the attacks on education. So this has specific variable if the attacks is on education. So I expect that because they mentioned this one, but maybe I need to verify this again. And secondly, for as you mentioned, the schools were being used by the military and they can be evacuated. So in this analysis, so we have double difference. The first difference is between the within the KP. So those who are affected and those who are not. So for example, this group like 5 to 18. So this is the group within KP and also like other than KP. So if you think about the just first difference, so this control group from 18 to 19, they also belongs to KP region. Okay. So if there is some effect by the closure of schools, then this should be like below the 0. And what was else? So is it?
No, I mean, I was just asking that when you guys had that wider conversation in the background about all the other ways in which this data might have been generated to look like they were direct attacks on education or the process, as opposed to something that affects education, kind of like from a secondary perspective.
Actually, there is one data, it's ACLED, but they started in Pakistan from like 2017. We don't have before that, but maybe we can look into this and see.
And what is that? Sorry, what does it stand for?
It's armed conflict something. It's ACLED. You can just write if you want.
May I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
There's no other source that is in the model to explain the reduction in education beyond the attacks on terrorism. So all those things you're talking about, they're present in life, but they're not present in the school.
Can I just make a small comment? And I completely apologize that I had access to Google, and that's what I looked up. But 2012 is also when Malala was attacked. And it was a big thing that the Taliban were attacking girls for going to school. I wonder if that would also have an impact on parents getting scared and sending their daughters to school. I don't know.
Yeah, so yeah, that attack is in our like independent variables. Yes, it's on the X left hand side of the regression, not on the Y.
Maybe
So-
you want to see if it has an effect on, if
Um,
controlling for that has an effect. But I don't know how that would.
Actually, what I argue is the attacks are endogenous. So if there's attack on Malala, it's endogenous, it's not exogenous. So uh, that's why we instrument. So killing a leader, killing bin Laden is on one side, but the attacks is on the other hand side. So the one we are talking about, it's like our independent, you can consider it as independent variable, not the,
I see.
yeah. But I think this national action plan could be used. Yeah.
More question before we move on to our second speaker? Guessing not. All right. Thank you very much, Saqib.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Shahzad Ahmad from the IBA, who will be talking about Bayesian estimation of a pragmatic model for monetary policy analysis, the case of Pakistan. Shahzad, good?
Okay, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. My name is Shahzad Ahmad. I'm a joint director in State Bank of Pakistan and a visiting faculty member at IBA Karachi. So today I am here to talk about my paper, Bayesian estimation of a pragmatic model for monetary policy analysis, the case of Pakistan. So I start with a disclaimer: the views, projections, and analysis that are presented in the paper are all of them are based upon personal analysis, and they do not represent the institutions I and the co-author, Professor Waliullah, belong to. And the paper has been released in State Bank of Pakistan's working paper series, and the paper is available on State Bank of Pakistan's website. So we have divided the presentation in 4 main sections. Number 1 is introduction and background motivation. Number 2 is the quarterly projections model. In this section, we briefly talk about the structure of the model. And then in section 3, we discuss how the model has been empirically estimated and how we have evaluated the model in terms of forecasting performance of that model. And finally, in section 4, discuss how we have applied the model for real-time policy analysis. So we start with introduction. So in its flexible inflation targeting strategy, State Bank of Pakistan has been using a semi-structural DSGE model. DSGE stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Model for quite some time. And this forecasting and policy analysis system, which is shortly called FPAS, or another famous name is Quarterly Projection Model, QPM, has been approved by Monetary Policy Analysis and has been discussed in Monetary Policy Committee meeting minutes. Myself and Farooq Pasha introduced the model in 2015 for the first time. In that paper, we provided the basic version of the model by providing calibration of coefficients that are being used in the model, and we highlighted the forecasting strengths of that model in case of Pakistan by comparing the forecasting performance of that model with Bayesian, VAR, VAR, and other competing empirical forecasting methods. But in this paper, we argue that although useful as a first step, yet calibration is not the best way to parameterize a general equilibrium model. So here is the 6 steps strategy for quarterly projections model. And this strategy has been offered by Andrew Berg and Douglas Laxton. With more than 10,000 of citations, Douglas Laxton is one of the pioneers of general equilibrium models in case of monetary policy analysis, especially these QPM and FPOS type models. And the 6 steps strategy tells that in the first step, when you want to build a quarterly projection model for monetary policy analysis, in the first step, the model development team should review existing models and see how they are being used for monetary policy analysis. In the second step, they should calibrate and design a basic version of quarterly projections model. In the third step, they should develop an initial working model. And when we talk about an initial working model, so here we mean that a model that is capable of addressing a very relevant questions, and it should be capable of providing precise answers to the questions posed by monetary policy makers. And in the fourth step, the formal model that has been initialized in the third step should be tested through a comparison of its forecasting and empirical properties. And once this basic model is ready and has been tested, in the next stage, the modeling team should go for formal Bayesian estimation of that general equilibrium model. And finally, in the long run, the model should be improved by development of institutional knowledge. So these four steps have been covered in the first paper that I authored with Farooq Pasha in 2015. So now is the appropriate time, and that is the background motivation for writing of this paper. So now we discuss the basic structure of that model. The model has been divided in 4 blocks of behavioral equations. Number 1 is aggregate demand side, which is a dynamic IS curve. In this IS curve, we link output gap with real monetary conditions index, foreign demand, and a lag of output gap. And the supply side contains 3 Neo-Keynesian-Phillips curves for core inflation, food inflation, energy inflation, and the headline CPI inflation is calculated as a weighted average of core, food, and energy inflation. In monetary policy block, central bank responds to deviation of inflation forecast from the inflation target and increase in output gap, because increase in output gap implies that the economy is overheated and central bank needs to increase interest rate to reduce the aggregate demand, and central bank responds to expected depreciation by increasing interest rates so that capital outflows could be checked. Finally, the external sector is a modified version of uncovered interest rate parity conditions. So this is the monetary policy transmission mechanism of the model. So central bank changes short-run interest rate, SR stands for short-run. So the changes in short-run interest rate leads to changes in long-run interest rates and exchange rates. So both of these variables combine together to determine the real monetary conditions index. And this real monetary conditions index leads to changes in output gap. And output gap affects inflation, and the changes in current inflation affect inflation expectations, and then there is a feedback loop between current inflation and expected inflation. So that is the basic structure of monetary policy transmission mechanism. If we have some financial shocks, for example, if foreign interest rates increase and there are capital outflows from the economy, these shocks affect exchange rate. And then if there are some fiscal policy shocks or there are some negative shocks to consumer confidence, then these shocks affect output gap. And the productivity shocks and oil prices and taxes and things like that, they affect inflation level. So next we discuss how the model has been empirically estimated and evaluated. So we have used 3 parameterization strategies. Number 1 is calibration. As I discussed earlier, we used calibration in our previous paper as well. So here we have used calibration for the sake of comparison. And then the second strategy is maximum likelihood estimation. And the third is Bayesian maximum likelihood estimation. And we have evaluated the 3 competing parameterization strategies through running a pseudo out-of-sample recursive forecasting exercise that starts from 2001 and ends at 2023 Q1. So in this recursive forecasting exercise, we recursively generate forecasts of key macroeconomic variables for 8 quarters, and then doing so we have 46 windows of all of these windows are of 8 quarters. So the variables included in this forecast exercise include headline inflation, core inflation, food inflation, energy inflation, interest rate, exchange rate, and real GDP growth. So this is a sample diagram of recursive forecast exercise. In this diagram, this black bold dotted line shows the actual data of quarter on quarter CPI inflation rate, and the thin red lines show the recursive forecasts. And we can see that red lines quite closely match, provide a fairly close match to the actual data. And these are the charts of root mean squared errors that have been calculated from the recursive forecasts showed in the previous diagram. And the green line shows the root mean squared error from Bayesian ML parameterization, and the dotted line shows the calibration root mean squared error, and the thin dotted line shows the simple maximum likelihood based root mean squared errors. So in case of four most important macroeconomic variables, that is CPI inflation, GDP growth, nominal interest rate, and exchange rate, we can see that the Bayesian maximum likelihood provides the minimum amount, the lowest amount of root mean squared error. So that's why we established that, that's how we established that the Bayesian ML is capable of providing the forecast with minimum error. And next we discuss how the model has been utilized for real-time policy analysis. So we offer three applications. Number one is multivariate Kalman filter based gap analysis. Number two is impulse response function analysis. And number three is forecasting and scenario analysis. So here we present three most important gap variables. Number one is real GDP gap. So this is the blue dotted line shows the trend or natural level of GDP, and this green line shows the actual level of real GDP, of course in 100 times log. And the deviation between both of these lines show the real GDP gap or output gap. So we can see that in case of COVID, the real GDP gap was very, very negative, implying a deep recession. And then here is real exchange rate gap. So this, again, this dotted line shows the equilibrium value of exchange rate. The green line shows the actual value of real exchange rate. And this line shows the real exchange rate gap. And we can see that at the terminal time period, the real exchange rate gap was positive, implying that the domestic currency, that is Pak rupee, was substantially undervalued, which implied that the Pakistan currency was undervalued and exchange rate had overshot in terms of depreciation. So this is the real interest rate gap, at which we can see that was quite negative because of very high rate of inflation. And these are our impulse response functions. So we concentrate on this green line, which shows the BML or Bayesian maximum likelihood parameterization. So when there is a shock to nominal interest rate, this leads to increase in nominal interest rate. It is monetary policy shock. An increase in nominal interest rate leads to an increase in real interest rate and real interest rate gaps. And then this increase in real interest rate, it translated into tightening of monetary conditions index, which leads to a reduction in output gap. And as discussed in the transmission mechanism diagram, the reduction in output gap leads to reduction in headline inflation. And through expectations channel, the reduction in headline inflation leads to core inflation and food inflation as well. And then there is exchange rate channel of monetary policy. Increase in nominal interest rate leads to appreciation. This negative change in real exchange rate shows real exchange rate appreciation, which leads to reduction in imports, an increase in imports and reduction of imports. So a reduction of exports lead to reduction in output gap and domestic demand. So this reduction in exports also leads to tightening of monetary conditions index, which lowers output cap and inflation. Next, we discuss the application of the model for baseline versus stress scenario analysis, and then we talk about a few basic monetary policy experiments. So, in our baseline versus alternate or stress scenario analysis, we have incorporated four very relevant factors of Pakistan economy, that is political uncertainty, climate risks, global commodity prices, tightening of global financial conditions. So these are our assumptions. So we assume that the continuity of geopolitical tensions in the global stage may lead to increase in global food prices and global energy prices. So the red line shows the stress scenario assumptions. Food price inflation may be higher, and energy price inflation may also be higher in the stress scenario relative to the baseline scenario. And the inflation in commodity prices may lead to inflation in global headline inflation. And then this increase in global headline inflation may elicit appropriate monetary policy stance from global central banks, which would lead to a reduction in global output. So these are the results of our scenario analysis. So our results show that if all of the stress scenario assumptions realize simultaneously, then this could have led to a very high and persistent level of inflation. And of course, in case of food inflation as well, and core inflation as well. And this simultaneous realization of these stress scenario assumptions would have led to a very large and persistent decline in real GDP, but owing to base effect, the real GDP growth might have surged to a relatively higher position. So these two baseline charts show about slightly just the difference of 1 quarter. So at the end, this yellow line shows the baseline projections made at the end of 2022 quarter 4, and this green line shows the baseline assumptions made the end of only 3 months after, that is 23 quarter 1. So that was the quarter in which our exchange rate observed a massive depreciation of around 50 rupees, and macroeconomic outlook deteriorated substantially because of this very massive amount of depreciation and very elevated level of economic uncertainty. So here, these two baselines have been drawn to show that the massive depreciation and elevated level of uncertainty may lead to a very substantial level of deterioration in macroeconomic outlook. So next we talk about monetary policy experiments. So we have conducted 2 experiments, 2 counterfactual scenarios. Number 1 is accommodating monetary policy stance, in which we assume that interest rate would be 200 basis points lower relative to the baseline path for the first 4 quarters of the forecast horizon. And in the extinguishing our tight monetary policy stance, we assume that interest rate would be 200 basis points higher than the baseline path for the first 4 quarters of the forecast horizon. So these are the results of our monetary policy counterfactual scenario analysis. So we see that in case of accommodating monetary policy scenario, which is represented by this purple line, inflation would have been at a relatively higher position, and of course real GDP could also be at a higher position, but only for a short while. And afterwards, the real GDP would decline even the baseline scenario, which is shown by the green line. And if we adopt the consolidating monetary policy scenario, we can see that real GDP growth would be low in case of short run, but it would be higher in the medium term. And of course, inflation would be relatively at a lower position if we adopt a consolidating monetary policy scenario. So based on these results, we conclude, so here we come to the overall conclusion. So we established the superiority of forecast performance of Bayesian maximum likelihood based quarterly projection model, And results of gap analysis show that Pakistan economy was passing through a recession with overshot exchange rate. And scenario analysis results show that continuity of political uncertainty along with a simultaneous realization of risk factors, namely climate risks, commodity prices, global financial conditions, could lead to a substantial deterioration of Pakistan's macroeconomic outlook. And results of our simulations advocate adoption of consolidating monetary and fiscal policy stance to achieve disinflation and sustainable growth. As we show that if we adopt loose monetary policy stance, it could yield some some gains in terms of output growth, but they are not going to be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahzad. If I can now ask Daniel Khan to present his comments.
So thank you so much for that presentation. I'll begin. I'll go through a few things. I think I have about 6-7 points. So please feel free to note them, and then we can hopefully talk about them. The first thing is the scenario analysis results. My suspicion is that my impression is they're not particularly novel, and they're also largely intuitive. And so, or is there a novel interpretation in the current context that I am missing? Perhaps you can speak a little bit about that. Secondly, I'm going to ask two fundamental, what I think are really fundamental questions. That's a bad habit. The first thing is the superior forecast, and can you speak a little bit about why that matters? And the Berg et al. 6-step framework, the final step of improving institutional knowledge, what does that lead to then? Because I would understand that is some sort of recursive process rather than a strategy that just ends at the 6th step. So what are the stakes in that process, in that 6-step modeling strategy? And the reason I'm asking this is because I'm curious as to whether this model or the state bank's FPAS QPM model, whether it's a TSTE model, whether these models can endogenize something like political instability, what we would usually think of as an exogenous shock, or the climate crisis, for example, or climate conditions, or the deterioration of the environment. So can this be endogenized? And so can we start to see because if we can't, and I think that's important, because if we can't endogenize something like political instability, then as economists, the road comes to an end really, really quickly. And after saying there is unfortunately a lot of political instability, there is not much more left to say. So that if you can please address that. In terms of the policy implications, I think the very, very last one was this issue of sustainable growth. And I'm wondering whether the issue is less about whether the growth is sustainable and more about whether the growth is tolerable in terms of its social effects and environmental effects. And finally, just one last comment is that I was just very happy to see a Bayesian analysis, because there's such a focus on frequentist techniques in economics that I think Bayesian techniques are underappreciated, and to the extent that technical analysis is important, I think Bayesian analysis is really the thing. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your valuable comments and questions. So, if we talk about the first question, that the results are not novel and quite intuitive. So, in response to this question, I would say that there are multiple interpretations. So, economists rarely agree, and there are multiple interpretations of the ongoing macroeconomic crisis. So, by doing the scenario analysis, we show that the intuitive things are not entirely misleading, and they do have empirical and model-based policy analysis support. So we establishing something is really important when we go into a policy discourse. So So we established that these things are there, so we need to consider them while we are going for some taking important policy decisions. And then you talk about political uncertainty and climate risks. So I have discussed in detail how I have incorporated these risks into the model. So about political, of course, there is no endogenous block regarding political uncertainty and climate risks. So this is a very basic kind of macroeconomic model. So we have not progressed so far in terms of macroeconomic modeling in Pakistan. So there are no endogenous blocks for political uncertainty and climate risks. But I would like to highlight how I have incorporated political uncertainty. We have certain assumptions, and there is a famous quote regarding forecasts, that models do not make forecasts, economists do. So forecasting is more than a mechanical and model-based job. Forecasting is indeed an art, and it comes always with certain assumptions. So we assume that political uncertainty will lead to a negative sentiment shock and a capital outflow from the country. So these are the two underlying assumptions when we talk about political uncertainty. And then if we talk about the climate risks, so we assume that climate risks will lead to increase in food inflation and a depreciation of exchange rate, because if climate related events lead to damage of our crops like cotton and wheat, then we have to rely on imported stuff. So in the quarters in which we face floods like Q3, because of monsoon, so we assume that exchange rate would receive a shock, and food price inflation would receive a shock. So that's how we have incorporated these two risk factors. So of course, maybe we should go for endogenizing these factors into the model, but let me tell you very honestly, this is not a simple task. And then sustainable versus tolerable growth, I would say that one of the major issues faced by Pakistan economy is that we have very, very low saving rate. When we compare regional saving rates, Pakistan ranks very low in terms of saving rates. So if we want to boost savings, then we need to provide incentive to savers, and keeping an elevated real interest rate is an incentive for savings. So that's why I think if we want to go for sustainable growth, go for sustainable level of investments, then we need to boost our saving level, and a substantially real positive interest rate, which can be obtained by consolidating monetary policy stance, is a step in that direction.
Thanks. Let me now open the floor up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a gentleman with a mic will come to you. Sarah.
Thank you for this very, I've never used Bayesian models, so this is partly also coming from ignorance, but I really enjoyed the way that you explained this. So just from my understanding, how much of the Bayesian modeling is dependent on prior distribution? So if I imagine if you change those distributions, then you could get different answers. And so in your sensitivity analysis, do you also see, because I imagine then you would give different kind of predictions, right? And the second thing is, I think the model does very well in reducing error, but does it provide any structural insights? Because I think that for policymakers, that's going to be more useful, right? So if you say, well, this alternate scenario is giving me a slightly different answer, they'd ask for why. And so then what would be the response be from this Bayesian perspective?
So the question about selection of prior is indeed a very, very relevant question. And changes in prior distributions may lead to changes in results. So in this paper, for selection of appropriate priors that could be defended, so we have used our previous paper parameters as priors, means of prior distributions. So when we did that paper, so we conducted interviews of policymakers and certain experts in monetary policy analysis, and we used those parameters as priors. So, and then of course we have the finally chosen set of priors make sure that the model provides relatively better forecast performance. And then in terms of structural analysis, of course we can do structural analysis by shock decompositions, in which we can explain what are the structural shocks that explain certain fluctuations of certain macroeconomic variables, but we have not conducted that analysis so far. Maybe we should include that analysis in our paper. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I have a question. So initially you introduced sort of this forecasting or sort of the Bayesian ML technique as a substitute for the standard DSG models, if I understood that right? I'm not a macro person, but my understanding is that one direction in which DSG models have evolved is to allow heterogeneity of consumer behavior, right? And I'm so wondering, just maybe this is, if you think this violates your, whatever your NDA requirements are with the state bank, please say, you can say that. But I'm wondering if at the state bank, if you've gone in that direction at all, because I understand that at least in the US Fed, they've done some work in terms of trying to do heterogeneous DSG models, right? Is it just a question of we don't have the kind of data to be able to sort of estimate those kind of models?
So if we talk about Bayesian estimation method, so it is an empirical estimation method. So the estimation method can be applied on representative agent models and also on heterogeneous agent models. So Bayesian is an estimation approach that could be applied on both type of models alike. So, and then if we talk about heterogeneous models in comparison to the representative agent models, so in this model as well, we have introduced a little bit of heterogeneity. As I discussed, we have three sectors of inflation. Number one, core, food, and energy price inflation. If you take the mainstay DSGE models, so you will not see variations in these sectors. So this model also incorporates price and wage rigidities. So this model incorporates to some extent heterogeneous agent models, but although not at a very higher and sophisticated level, because if we go into a very, very sophisticated model, it's really difficult to communicate it to policymakers. So we have to evaluate a trade-off in terms of policy analysis and communication, because if we come up with a model that is so complicated and sophisticated that cannot be communicated to policymakers or general public, and most of them are not economic modeling experts, so it's less likely that the policy analysis of the model would be taken seriously by the senior level policymakers.
Questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We had scheduled one other speaker, Shagufta Sultana. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, so I think we'll have to wrap it up here. Please join me in thanking our panelists and as well as discussants, and thank you everybody as well.